good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Now, around the world, anxiety is rising. Incomes are stagnant, jobs are unstable, and the cost of living keeps climbing. And into this moment of instability and uncertainty comes an idea that's been debated and dismissed, but now is increasingly being taken seriously: a basic income for all. Now, my guest tonight is someone who has spent decades at the forefront of this conversation, Professor Guy Standing. He's a Labour economist, an author, and the founding member of the Basic Income Earth Network, which is an NGO that campaigns for basic income as a right for all. Professor Standing was an economic advisor for the Prime Minister's department in Malaysia in the 1980s, so we'll talk to him a little bit about that. He's also worked as a social and labour policy advisor with various other governments around the world, including the US and South Africa. So, Professor Standing, thank you so much for being on the show with me today.
It's a pleasure.
You had a fantastic keynote session earlier today at the International Social Wellbeing Conference, in which you touched on several things. So about a decade and a half ago, you warned of an emergence of a new class, a new social class. You called it the precariat. And they are not defined by just financial insecurity or financial precarity, but also the fact that there's chronic uncertainty, there is a lack of agency and instability in the world. So I'm curious to know, was it 14 years now since you first coined the term? Has that group changed? Has the precariat changed? That precariat today, does it look different from when you first coined it 14 years ago?
I wrote this book, The Precariat, The New Dangerous Class. It was published in 2011, right? So at that time, I was analyzing how it was growing all over the world. People not only in unstable, insecure jobs, but with low volatile earnings, in debt, and not having a narrative to give to their lives. They're living bits and pieces lives, and they know it. And their level of schooling or education is often above the level of job they can expect to get. And they're losing the rights of citizenship. Now, when I wrote the book, I was aware that this is mainly about the young, mainly about women, mainly people, minorities. And I wrote on page 1 that unless politicians woke up to it, there would be the emergence of a political monster. Now, I think since then, and the book has been translated into 25 languages, including Chinese, but not, sadly, so far Malay. It's gone into a number of editions, and the composition has been changing. To start with, a large part of the precariat were people falling out of old working class communities and traditions. Many of them didn't have a lot of formal education, and these people feel they've lost yesterday. They feel that yesterday is better than today. And they listen to populists, they listen to Donald Trump or the equivalent in Europe, or Modi.
America great again.
Yeah. Now, the second group in the precariat I call the nostalgics. Now, this group doesn't have a sense of the present. They're the migrants, the minorities. They don't have a sense of home. They feel they've lost a present. Now, this group won't vote for fascists or populists, but they are disenfranchised. They feel cut off from society, and they're demonized by the first group and by some others as the cause of the problem, but of course they're not. They're not. And there's the third group, which are the young, with more women than men, who go to college, go to education, and their parents and their teachers said, if you do that, you will have a future. And they come out, and they haven't got a future. And they are very angry and annoyed, and they often have debt, and they are looking for a new politics, a new utopian type of ideas to lead them. Now, the composition you asked me about has changed. But unfortunately, we've got to the point where it hasn't changed enough. And the atavists, that first group, have just re-elected Donald Trump in the United States because there's been an alliance between the plutocracy, the plutocrats, the Elon Musks and everything, who sold a false agenda to the insecure part of the precariat who voted for them. But the progressives, the people who've lost a future, they didn't vote for Trump. They didn't vote at all. And so this composition is changing, but so far we're in a dangerous period.
Did you anticipate the composition changing?
Yes.
You
yes.
did.
Oh, yes.
So what is it that you think the political class or politicians do not understand, fail to understand, governments fail to understand about this political monster that you've described?
Well, I think for a start, the far right have understood the
this
precariat far better
and
than the old left. Okay, the old left wanted to put the bottle back in shape. Okay, and their agenda is essentially social democratic. They wanted jobs, more full-time jobs, more decent wages. Okay, well, that's not going to happen. Not going to happen in the sense that more and more jobs don't pay enough to give a person a dignified living, okay? And in a sense, it shouldn't be, if you took a sensible approach, that wouldn't be too worrying, you could adjust. Because what I've described as rentier capitalism means that more and more of the income being generated in production and in the markets is going to the owners of property. Okay, they're taking it all, the financiers, the people who are owning the intellectual property, patents and so on, they're taking more and more money. The precariat is doing jobs and having to do much more work than ever. Much of the work that the precariat do is not recorded. It's not recorded. They're searching for short-term jobs. They're applying for jobs. They're doing more retraining. And this is exhausting. More care work, more volunteering, but they don't get income. Now we have a crisis because the old left groups, if you like, haven't woken up to the fact that you need to change your social protection system to give security to people, to recycle the income being generated in the rentier economy in order to give a share and encourage people to adopt a new way of living, okay? Right. Which involves a lot of work, okay? We all want to work. 99% of us want to work because we want to improve the lives of our loved ones, our communities, ourselves, and you don't need to force people to want to work, but the jobs that are being offered are not sexy, to put it mildly. Many of the jobs, people say, I don't want to do it.
Right.
They just do it because they have to.
Could you explain a little bit or elaborate a little bit more about rentier capitalism and its unfortunate consequence of inequality and how you think basic income for all would be you described it as a social vaccine, which I'm thrilled with this phrase. So talk to me about this basic income as a social vaccine. How might it work and why do you think it's a necessary correction from rentier capitalism?
Well, I think that if you go for conventional economic growth, as most governments are, GDP growth, by now they should have learned that almost all the extra income generated goes upwards into the plutocracy and the elite, and some coming down into salaried, high-level jobs. It's not going down. It's not trickling down. No. Okay, it's not trickling down. And in that context, you say, let's realize that jobs have only been a fetish for 100 years.
A fetish?
A fetish. Because before that, most people in the 19th century, the 18th century, or going back throughout history, would have done anything they could to avoid being in jobs. I'm serious. And all the rebellions in my own country, Great Britain, all the rebellions throughout our history were about trying to stop having to be in jobs so that they could be doing work on their own and commoning and doing other activities. Now we have to have an imaginative approach to this. Now the problem we have today is not just inequality and inequalities, but chronic insecurity, okay? Which of course for the precariat is the #1 phenomenon. Now insecurity is a pandemic at the moment, but it's mainly about uncertainty. Now I'm an economist, and uncertainty for an economist is not like ordinary risk or a contingent, what we call contingency risk. If you have a job, you have a probability of becoming unemployed. So I can work out what's the probability of people becoming unemployed, and then I can work out how much the loss might be. I could work out a social insurance system that you could give people security.
Right.
Today we have a different situation. We have a situation where any of us could be hit by systemic shocks. A classic case was the COVID pandemic, right? It hit whole communities. It hit people who never thought they would be at risk. The same with natural disasters, the same with financial crises. These are systemic crises. Now, we don't have a social vaccine, and therefore, when these shocks hit, millions of people are affected. And what I was arguing in my books and things, not only are they affected in the process, but people are fearful all the time of that bit happening. So it plays on stress. And that stress induces ill health, morbidity, and what we've seen is a rising number of deaths of despair. That's the term, deaths of despair. Particularly among the young, okay? Young women in rich countries. The suicide rate has gone up tremendously, and the attempted suicide rate. And it goes all the way through life. But the point is that if you mean that young people in the precariat have illnesses, have cardiac problems, have mental problems, that shortens their lifespan and their active lifespan. So it's something that's cumulative through their lives. So it's not just to the young, it's a whole thing.
Okay. So basic income as a social vaccine to this chronic instability that you talked about. Can I ask you about how mainstream this conversation has become in the time that you've been working on this? Has it become more acceptable now? And I'm curious to better understand where that resistance is coming from. What do you think makes people balk at it? Is it ideological? Well, is it political? What is it?
I think we're winning the debate.
Okay, more people now? All right, more acceptable?
I'll come to that.
Okay.
I mean, I think that it's been a long journey, but let me, for your listeners, your viewers, let me define what I mean by a basic income before we discuss the evolution of the idea. Idea of a basic income is that every individual citizen or usual resident citizen in Malaysia or any other country has periodic modest payment, pay per month, some amount which gives some basic security. It's not a high level, it's paid individually, so that it's paid equally to each man and each woman, with a smaller amount per child given to the mother, the surrogate mother. It's unconditional in behavioral terms. In other words, you don't have to do X, Y, and Z in order to get it. And it's unconditional in terms of marital status, work status, or age, with supplements paid for people who've got disabilities because they've got extra costs of living. So you would want everybody to have equal material base. Now, the simplest rationale is that it's a matter of common justice, okay? Every society I've ever worked in, and I've worked in many, many countries, accepts private inheritance of private wealth. If I'm not mistaken, that's a lot of something for nothing. The persons receiving it
yes.
have done nothing to deserve it,
Just inheriting it, yes.
other than being born in a particular
the right
bed.
family.
Now, if you allow private inheritance of private wealth, why don't we have public inheritance of public wealth? We know that, and people like Warren Buffett have the sense to recognize it, the income and wealth of every single one of us is far more to do with the efforts and achievements of the many generations before us than anything we do ourselves, right? But I don't know if your mothers and your father, your grandpa, etc., did more than mine, right? We don't know that, and we can't know that. And therefore, if you accept private inheritance of private wealth, you should say shared inheritance of public wealth. So for me, that's the first justification. Second justification, if you're religious, you can say, look, Allah has given us unequal talents, unequal capacities to make money, unequal capacities to be clever, all right? And in a sense, a basic income is a compensation paid to everybody for those who don't have that capacity. Now, I believe it should be universal in the sense that every person who's a resident in a community should be paid equally. And the reason I do that is that targeting has huge exclusion errors. In other words, if I say I'm only giving it to the poor, I've got to identify the poor, prove that they're poor, do the paperwork, and we know from hundreds of policies all over the world that there's high exclusion errors. Yes. In other words, targeting on the poor results in many of the poor not getting anything. Yeah. And high inclusion errors, a lot of the people who actually get it are not actually poor. And then you have a poverty trap. A poverty trap means that if you are getting something because you're poor, if you try to become non-poor, you lose the benefit and you hardly get any extra.
It's the benefits cliff.
It's called a poverty trap.
You lose what you've been getting before, yes.
A poverty trap. In addition, with the modern labor markets that we have what I've called in my books a precarity trap. Now, a precarity trap means this. If you're unemployed, the sort of job that you're likely to get back into a job is going to be short-term, casual, low-paid, and last for a very short time. Okay? Now, you may spend months trying to get some benefits, and then they tell you you've got to take a short-term job. You could be out of a job again, applying to get it and be in the queue. Yeah. So you could actually easily end up with much less by taking that short-term job. Now, this is stupid, okay? So we create in our existing schemes not only poverty traps and precarity traps, but moral hazards. A moral hazard is you don't do something that you would otherwise do because you'd be penalized. So you don't do it. You don't take that short-term job, even though it would actually give you some nice extra money. But it also encourages an immoral hazard. If you're poor and you know you're going to lose the benefit, and you take a job on the side, you wouldn't declare it, would you? I mean, come on. I mean, we'd all behave like that, but then you risk becoming criminalized, right. which is crazy. So for me, a much better system is you give people a low basic income with supplements for disability, and then you have an insurance system built on top of that for things like unemployment, for accidents, for frailty, and so on. So you have a multitude, but you give everybody this social vaccine. Now, what we found in our pilots in our experiments in places like India, Southern Africa, in Brazil, in Canada, in the United States, in Finland, in Wales. We've just completed a pilot.
So many places.
So many places. What happens is that when you give people a modest basic income, their mental health improves. Their mental bandwidth
the stresses
improves.
You talked about. Yeah.
Exactly. Their physical health improves, both short-term and long-term. They behave better. And please listen to this, because this is the biggest prejudice that we hear all the time by people who don't know what they're talking about. They say if you gave a person a basic income, they would become lazy.
They won't want to work anymore.
They won't want to work. We find that if people have a basic income, they work more. M-O-R-E. And they're more productive in their work. And the reason is they often have more confidence, they can often buy clothes, they can often pay for commuting, they have more energy, they take more risks, entrepreneurial risks. One of the things with the basic income scheme in part of South Korea is that the young people became much more entrepreneurial. They took more risks.
Wow.
Now, isn't that what you want?
Yes.
Now, for me, and the same with schooling, you know, it often leads to say, okay, now I've got a basic income, I can take a risk of going to college and taking more. So it's wrong, that prejudice. The other prejudice is that we can't afford it.
Okay, yeah, that it's not fiscally sustainable.
Now, I've just told the Prime Minister that I salute what his government is trying to do in raise the share of the total income in the country going to people who do labour and work from 32% to over 40%. I think that's a laudable objective, very good guideline. One way of doing that is to take the subsidies that are being given in this country, huge number of subsidies, and have a rationalization. But we know that subsidies are regressive. In other words, they increase inequalities. They are inefficient. They are subject to cronyism and all sorts of corruptions. But if you don't recycle them in a way that improves income security of the precariat, people will be very angry.
Right.
And they will be right to be angry.
I hear
And
you.
this is an opportunity to reach out so that Malaysia can be a leading example of combating the drift to populism, combating the drift to morbidity, more short-term active lives because people are suffering from internal illnesses, cancers and things. And there are various ways I've explained in my book, building up capital funds and then paying a gradually rising amount that makes it feasible. And I believe it enhances freedom. Let me give some example. Was in Southern Africa, in Namibia, where we did a pilot. And at the end of the pilot, I called some young teenage women across. They were wearing nice new T-shirts. I called them across. And I said, what's been the best thing for you for having a basic income? What's been the best thing? And they were, you know, giggly and, you know, they were teenagers. And then one of them had the courage, talking to me, it was a foreigner and all, right? One of them said, excuse me, but before, when the men came down from the fields at the end of the month with their money in their pocket, we had to say yes. Now we have our own money, we say no. That's freedom. That's freedom. And for women to be able to walk out of abusive relationships or to be having a sense of agency is vital. And that's why I've found that even though sometimes women's groups are, you know, suspicious of these schemes, once they see ordinary women who've got it and how, it gives me power, and I can afford this for my child and you can't go off with it because it's the child or mine, okay? It empowers. Now, You don't have to be Einstein to work out that this is how human beings behave. And if everybody in the community suddenly has some basic income security, what it does is induces solidarity.
Sense of community.
Sense of solidarity.
That, yes.
And what you see, I remember another thing we saw in another African pilot is that once everybody had basic income, they formed a local committee to advise on children's education. And what they were doing was they were going to families who were not sending the children to school and saying, now you have your basic income, you can send it, you must, okay? And it had changed everything. So you had 99% attendance rate in the primary schooling. Now that sort of change, as I was saying in my speech with the Prime Minister, has feedback effects. In other words, it means that the efficiency of your public schooling is improved, your efficiency of your public health is improved, saves public money, and improves economic growth in the longer term. So you have a multiplier effect, and you liberate. And that's why when I see that sort of thing, I break down sometimes, and you just say,
This is what a basic income can do for communities. Professor Standing, I could talk to you for another hour or so, but I won't keep you here. Thank you so much for sharing some of your insights and the work that you've been doing in this area. I appreciate your time.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
That's all the time we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thanks so much for watching. Good night.